as far as I'm concerned, there are no black people and white people. We're all immigrants. We're all mixed in this United States. So as far as I'm concerned, when I'm addressing history, I'm addressing the history of us as Americans, as the people of color, black, white, indigenous. And I'm proud to be able to represent us as a community at every time I can. And I'm fortunate enough to have as a colleague Bob Geake. And so I'm going to just say that this, I'm going to thank the Battle of Rhode Island Association Lecture Tour, which is sponsored by the Massachusetts Society of Cincinnati and partners with Rhode Island Slave History Battalions and the Middle Passage Port Margaret Project and the NAACP in honoring Black History Month. At Risham, we try to celebrate Black History Month every month. So now, Robert Geake, who is, by the way, a reenactor with the First and Second Regiment. In fact, I'd like to recognize Senator Linda Pucci-Fuccio, who's there. Would you please stand? She brought us to the Senate so that we could get a recognition as February 15th as the time that recognizes the First Black Regiment. And it was an honor to be able to be there with the senators who were acknowledged as Bob was there and me, and you see our friend back there who is in uniform. And it's just an exciting and warm feeling for me to know that all of you are coming out because you're in support of something that is beyond the fray, beyond the name of form. I mean, the Black Regiment held the Hessians 3 times at the Battle of Rhode Island and are actually heroes because that was the first battle. And they were untried soldiers. In fact, people didn't think because of their color, they could be the soldiers that they were. But, I've served in 5 countries, and not in the military, but served in 5 countries. And, we're Americans. That's all I can say, And I'm proud to be that and proud to serve as an American. So anyway, my good friend Robert Geake is a historian who's written 15 books. When I say historian, he's not kidding. One of them is with the first book that really touched me when I came back to Rhode Island is the Rhode Island First Regiment, which is the Slaves to Soldiers. That book changed my mind and made me join the Black Regiment. The other books is the history of the Narragansett Tribes, the New England Citizen Soldiers, the Journal of Nora Robinson of Attleboro, and he's in the process of another title, The Battle of Field of the American Revolution. I mean, Bob serves 2 terms as president of Smith Castle, and I'm going to tell you, the second battalion we put at Smith Castle because it was such first of it, it's a beautiful place, it's a farm. But second, there's 200 people of color buried there, enslaved people buried there. And thanks to his history, because he's part of he's chairman of the Association of Education at Smith Castle for the museum house, he was able to tell us stories about the soldiers who were enslaved, who fought for their freedom and joined the Black Regiment. Names that are on the walls of Patriots Park right now, so that they are enshrined and they cannot be forgotten. He has also served as an advisory board for Rhode Island Slave History Medallions, and I would like to thank him to the stage, and so he can speak. And thank you, Jason Rome back there, for representing the squad of the Black Regiment.
Well, it's wonderful to see all of you people here tonight. I must confess, as I was watching the weather forecast over the last few days, I wondered if we would be coming by boat, perhaps, than this. Okay. I need a little bit more light over here, if I can. Okay. So in this talk tonight, I hope to offer a representation of the First Rhode Island Regiment that takes us outside of the battles that have been written about, especially the Battle of Rhode Island, which has gotten a lot of attention, and of course the association has sponsored this talk, and informs us of what life was like for these and other soldiers of the Revolutionary War. And it reminds us that war was a year-round event. People may have gone into the main body of the Army, may have gone into winter encampments, but there were soldiers everywhere guarding the coastline, especially in Rhode Island and along southern New England. That was a prerogative to guard the coastline against raids and British invasions. And as we'll see, those raids happened quite often. So as we'll see also, these winters of discontent, where the Rhode Island Regiment was forced to stay behind in Rhode Island and not join the main army, actually grew them. It matured them as soldiers, and it helped them to evolve into the regiment that they would eventually become and be known for, especially in Philadelphia when they were guarding Philadelphia. So following the Battle of Rhode Island, the troops were disbanded, and the Rhode Island Regiment was ordered to a redoubt in East Greenwich. And I'm going to read a little bit from the timeline periodically. For those of you who may not know, I just completed a timeline of the Rhode Island Regiment that goes from 1777, when they first fought, black soldiers first fought at Fort Mercer with Colonel Christopher Greene, and their performance in the field impressed him and Samuel Ward so much that they went to Varnum and said, I think we should and we can make a regiment of black soldiers. And that was the impetus for the Rhode Island Regiment. Okay, so on October 31st, 1778, General Sullivan dismissed the militia units that had embedded into the Continental Army for the siege of Rhode Island. The remaining brigades and regiments are ordered to defensive positions along the coastline. Colonel Christopher Greene's regiment was assigned to the redoubt around East Greenwich. Colonel Greene's regiment was joined by those under command of Colonel Nathaniel Wade, and the two regiments repaired and manned the redoubts along that section of coastline. Colonel Greene ordered the regiments to maintain a disciplined training, and guards were posted at Quidnesset Neck and a row guard between Pojack Point and Quonset Neck in North Kingstown. Second slide. Okay. So this is Pojack Point, as you see, and what they would do is that, if you can see Pojack Point, they would row down the coastline to guard against vessels, British vessels coming into Quidnesset, and that happened quite a bit, unfortunately. So Colonel Greene wrote to General Sullivan on September 9th, 1778, to express his concern about the poor state of artillery and ammunition for the troops stationed in East Greenwich. Dear General, I sent my brigade quartermaster to Providence the day before yesterday after the necessary ammunition for the cannon and musketry. We have 9-pounders mounted on field cartridges without one single appurtenance for her. There is neither sponge, ladle, or worm belonging to any of the cannon here. The QM says he could not get any at Providence, neither do we have slow match. This will show that we can make no use of the cannon we should have, should they ever be necessary. And Green writes, I am determined to defend this town at all events should it be attacked. Should it be soon, our small arms must be all the defense that we can make. I thought it my duty to let you know the situation here. We have not a single artilleryman at this post. I earnestly wish that if it can be spared, it may be soon. It gives me great concern to have charge of a post in so defenseless a situation. And through October, the First Rhode Island Regiment continued on guard and garrison duty with 5 companies. The veteran company of enlistees, once under command of Captain Thomas Arnold at Valley Forge, was now given to Captain Thomas Cole. These were the men at Valley Forge, the black soldiers who were formed into what was the original Rhode Island Regiment. And so they had the benefit of being trained by Baron von Steuben once he had arrived. And it was their training, in fact, that was of great help to those soldiers, those newer soldiers, the new recruits in East Greenwich, as they converged for the Battle of Rhode Island. Those veteran soldiers had been trained. They also fought at Monmouth as well, with great distinction. So those were the veterans, and unfortunately there were only about 32 of them in all by the time that the Battle of Rhode Island got underway. But their experience gave them some added fortitude to the Rhode Island Regiment, and also helped them in the battle, as we'll see. So, October 19th, in a letter to General John Stark in Albany, General George Washington ordered the general to join General John Sullivan's forces in guarding the Rhode Island coastline. You can change it to the next one. Okay. And so, General Stark replied to Washington and departed from New York on the morning of October 27th. November 1788 saw that while meat from local cattle seemed to have been readily available, the shortage of flour for the troops guarding Rhode Island was raised repeatedly in letters from General Ezekiel Cornell and General Stark, whose men were without bread when they arrived in Rhode Island. These concerns, as well as an impending reduction of troops from the expiration of 2 companies of 6 months enlistees, were relayed in letters to General Washington from General Sullivan. By December, the Council of War is meeting, and it reads, their meeting of December 5th reads, whereas Major General Sullivan hath represented under this council that several of the inhabitants of the state have been detected in fraudulently taking and carrying away from the redoubts several articles of warlike stores, and also in buying and receiving from the soldiery under his command powder, lead, and many articles of clothing. The Council of War determined that the offenders be tried in Superior Court or before the Court of General Sessions of the Peace to be held in Providence, and that those responsible would be kept in custody for all such offenses, who to deliver to Major General Sullivan, and also to apprehend all such persons as shall be posted to him in guilty of the aforesaid offenses. Next slide. So by February 1st, a fleet of British raiding vessels known as the Tory Mosquito Fleet had resumed raids on Rhode Island and Massachusetts shoreline communities. On this day, February 1st, a loyalist raiding party landed in Quidnesset without raising any alarm from the soldiers, plundered the farm of Mr. Matthew Manchester, stealing 180 sheep, 19 head of cattle, and 80 bushels of corn. A few days later, Colonel Christopher Green would write to General Sullivan requesting 100 additional soldiers from General Varnum's brigade to guard Point Judith, where there remained, quote, a considerable quantity of ranging cattle. I'm very apprehensive, Green wrote, should they make any descent, it will be on Point Judith, as that part is full of fine stock. The weather is moderate and no troops in that quarter, so if 100 men could be spared to take the post there, I think it might answer a very valuable purpose. Well, as Greene had feared, that did come to pass. He had sent a small night guard to guard the shorelines along Quidnesset and also along the body of Boston Neck. But, as you can imagine, 100 soldiers is very few to guard that many miles. And so they were always running into difficulties. Next slide, please. So on February 24th, 1779, General Sullivan traveled to the post in East Greenwich to review the situation in person. While there, a large contingent of men from Glover's Continental Brigade participated in a sham fight against members of the Rhode Island Regiment and Sullivan's Life Guards. So if you're wondering what a sham fight is, if you've ever seen reenactors do a battle, that's pretty much what a sham fight is. You use gunpowder to make the illusion of a real battle, but you do not use bullets or lead or anything like that, or any ammunition. So on March 27, 1779, General Sullivan's return of strength and post records that finally the First Rhode Island Regiment is in pretty good shape. They have 140 men, they have 14 cannon, and 669 pounds of ammunition. His report also mentions fixing out 3 vessels for the defense of the harbor. Among them was Colonel Greene is fixing a large boat to row with 12 oars and have proper sails and to carry 6 swivels. And you see that boat there in the center. That is an actual boat that is in the Museum of the American Revolution. And that is a patrol boat, something that they would use to guard against vessels coming close to shore and setting in the raiding party. So the year of 1779 was to be an active one again for the regiment. The Loyalist raids launched from Newport continued into the spring and the summer. As Colonel Greene had feared, a substantial number of livestock were taken in a raid on Point Judith. The most significant moment, however, came in July of 1779 when members of the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment, stationed at Barber's Heights in North Kingstown, mutinied and began a march to East Greenwich. The 1st Rhode Island was placed on alert, and thankfully a confrontation was avoided through the efforts of Colonel Greene and Governor William Greene, who rode on horseback along the present post road to meet up with the soldiers and quell the rebellion. Now, if you're wondering, you hear mutiny and you think, that's terrible, why would they mutiny? Well, I want you to understand that this was the first time that America had a standing army, and it was all made up of militiamen. And militiamen were used to serving a certain amount of time. You would serve 3 weeks to 6 months, and they expected to be paid. And they mutinied because they had not been paid where they had served before, and they were ordered to march to North Kingstown. So when they got to North Kingstown, they sent one messenger to General Sullivan with a letter explaining that they had not been paid and could he process that. Well, Sullivan was not an intemperate man. He quickly arrested the man who had brought the letter, put him under court-martial, and sentenced him to death. So this is why they mutinied. And this happened throughout the war, through regiments and out the war, where there were mutinies and there were tensions between troops, because very often the Continental Congress did not have the money to pay the troops. And so soldiers were waiting months to get paid, and sometimes having to serve 3 or 4 terms without getting paid, and perhaps not even enough food or clothing. So a lot of problems that the Army had. So I want you to be aware of that. When you hear mutiny, it was a common term back then, not to be construed as it is today. So by the fall of 1779, the regiment had been greatly reduced in numbers, and this was reflected in the report given by the Inspector General of the Army, Baron von Steuben. Change it again, please. So von Steuben wrote that the Rhode Island Regiment could hardly be called a regiment. He said, this from its numbers can hardly be called a regiment, consisting of only 147 Negroes. And he said that they were in bad shape. They were not well trained or even really well abled. And so the general suggested then that the regiment be replaced in the Continental line with the State Regiment, then under Colonel John Topham. But I never found any evidence that that was even Executing a daring escape from Martha's Vineyard, 5 of the soldiers of the First Rhode Island Regiment who had been taken prisoner in Quidnesset on patrol the previous May stole a boat and made their escape to New Bedford and joined the army again in East Greenwich. The men reached the camp by the end of week of October 2nd, 1779. Now, American intelligence at this time informed General Washington that the British were taking steps to evacuate Rhode Island. News soon reached the men in the field. Jeremiah Greenman wrote in his diary, "This morn went to camp, and we were informed the enemy is about leaving Newport and have burnt the lighthouse, and a number of ships that lay upriver have fell down to the southward of the fleet." Change it again, please. Anticipating that the British would soon leave Newport, General Washington approved General Horatio Gates' plan to march to Hartford as soon as the British had left the island. But this stirred the fear of the inhabitants on the mainland, as expressed in a letter to General Nathaniel Greene in November. The British would eventually vacate the island on the 25th of October, 1779. So from the Council of War, it was represented that, again, given the situation, apparently some mainlanders were going to Newport and trying to steal goods from the sunken vessels, as well as the goods that were left behind by the British. And so again, General Cornell was said to prevent the goods or articles from being taken by private persons, and to apprehend and confine all such persons as may be detected for doing those crimes. Now, heading into the winter, the state received multiple petitions from officers for clothing, including the order for 150 pairs of shoes for the Rhode Island Regiment. You can switch it again, please. Winter also meant an increase in illness and hospitalization. The rather forthright recommendation that we'll read to General Cornell seems to indicate that the General Hospital in Providence was already at capacity. The General Council resolved that it be recommended to Brigadier General Cornell to order such repairs on the college edifice now used for a general hospital as may prevent any further damage to the buildings by storms, etc. It is further resolved, then recommended to Brigadier General Cornell to provide a proper place for a general hospital, and that in the future he does not permit any more sick soldiers to be put into the college, as the officers of said college are desirous of opening the same as soon as may be for the instruction of youth. Of course, the college edifice, the hall that was used for a hospital and a barracks, by the way, was the University Hall here at Brown University in Providence. Next slide, please. In the middle of November, Washington would write to General Greene once again. He wrote, "I had the pleasure of receiving your agreeable favors of the 29th and 22nd instant following, but Governor Greene," this is Governor Greene writing to Nathaniel Greene, he's still worried about Newport and leaving Newport abandoned. "There is a real probability," he wrote, "of the enemy's returning, should not the French fleet prevent them from coming this way, which means the inhabitants of the town who are well inclined might suffer greatly." The governor provided General Greene with a list of 48 men, women, and children, including 3 enslaved men who have left Newport and gone with the enemy, reporting then that there is about 1,400 tons of hay left by the enemy, which appears to be in very good and excellent order. Also 400 cords of wood, which is now in the hands of the continent. A very agreeable affair this, but can we continue to hold the island? We seem to be in a disagreeable situation, with the whole of the continental troops being now gone out of this state, and that into Connecticut. But as they are to take up these quarters at Hartford, it is very wisely ordered that they remain there in readiness to return again in case the enemy should do the like. So after receiving Governor Greene's letter, on reaching Hartford, General Horatio Gates received a letter from General Washington ordering Colonel Christopher Greene's regiment once again back to Rhode Island. So in January 1780, there was a very important promotion, and that was that 3 privates of the First Rhode Island Regiment were promoted to corporal. Private Prince Lemus of Captain John S. Dexter's company, Private Pero Mowry of Captain John Holden's company, and Private David Potter of Captain Elijah Lewis's company. These men achieved the highest rank of any of the enlisted black soldiers of the regiment. The winter of 1779 to 1780 was extremely harsh and included several deep falls of snow. Men seeking wood and provisions from Howland's Ferry were driven back by the depth of the snowdrifts. Colonel Greene wrote to Governor William Greene in January of that year, 1780, that the uncommon severity of the weather has caused me to reduce the garrison to 180, officers included, as well as artillery and infantry. Our wood is within 3 or 4 days of being out, and being well assured that there is not the least probability of being supplied from the mainland, I have this day ordered the racks belonging to Colonel Wanton cut up and carried into the wood yard to be dealt out to the troops. In February 1780, the companies of Captain Thomas Cole and Elijah Lewis were sent to Providence as Newport had diminished supplies. The severe weather and lack of provisions brought on a rash of stealing from both military supplies and civilian stores in Newport. Colonel Christopher Greene increased the number of lashes given offenders, but as he wrote to Washington, change the slide please. As he wrote to Washington, I have been very severe in punishment for stealing, but almost to no purpose. There has hardly been a week's interval during the winter, but more or less have detected in stealing, breaking into shops and stores. I greatly fear they will not be broke of this detestable practice unless capital punishment takes place. Colonel Greene was, more specifically, writing the Commander-in-Chief concerning the repeated offensive and subsequent court-martial and death sentence handed down to Private Windsor Fry, whose proceedings he enclosed with the remarks. And he wrote, quote, "The one whose trial I have sent has been several times severely whipped for stealing, but to no purpose in reclaiming him. Should it be in your Excellency's opinion to punish capitally for such a crime as his, I think him as proper a subject as can be. I anxiously wish to know your Excellency's determination in the matter." Facing the death sentence, Private Fry had escaped his guard recently, nearly a month before the letter was actually written. So Washington approved the death sentence handed down by the court-martial the following day in absentia, as the whereabouts of Fry were still unknown. In March 1780, William Greene wrote to General Washington again, "Sir, I have the pleasure to inform you that the General Assembly in their last session, held on the 4th Monday of last month, did pass and receive that the state shall raise their quota, which is 810 men, including those already enraised in Colonel Greene and Angel's regiments, in consequence of which I am requested by said assembly to apply to your Excellency for one of these regiments to be stationed within the state." Again, wanting to have one continental regiment stay in the state. And if this is completed, the number apportioned to them, I flatter myself that you will think this request reasonable. So from the report of the committee appointed by the General Assembly related to the ways and means for procuring supplies for the Continental Army, on March 23rd, they voted that it was recommended to Caleb Gardnell, Esquire, Commissioner of Hides, to deliver to Colonel Christopher Greene the 155 pair of shoes that had been ordered for use of the battalion. Next slide, please. The summer months of 1780 were active yet again for the regiment, especially with the arrival of French troops under the Count Rochambeau. As the fall approached, they looked anxiously toward joining the Grand Army once again at its headquarters at West Point. In September, they finally received word to join the troops, but yet again, things did not go as planned. On September 3rd, General Heath wrote to General Washington to inform him of Rochambeau's approval of the release of the Rhode Island Continental 6 Months Battalion and the First Rhode Island Regiment under Colonel Greene to join Washington and the Grand Army in Morristown, New Jersey. But 2 weeks later, Colonel Christopher Greene, the First Rhode Island Regiment, and the Rhode Island Continental Battalion were transported from Newport to East Greenwich to begin preparing for their march to Morristown, New Jersey. On September 18th, General Rochambeau and Admiral de Terney departed Newport for a meeting with Generals Washington and Lafayette in Hartford, Connecticut. But during their absence, the reinforcements to the British fleet were sighted off of Long Island. Next slide, please. On September 22nd, alarmed by the recent activity and the reinforcement of the Royal Navy within such close proximity to Newport, General Heath once again ordered Colonel Christopher Greene's battalion back to Rhode Island. The battalion once again encamped near Gould's Hill and worked on the fortifications there as well as at Butts Hill. By the end of September, following the capture of British adjutant Major John Andre and the revelation of the treason and desertion of Major General Benedict Arnold, General Washington recalled General William Heath in the Grand Army of the Republic, and Colonel Christopher Greene was appointed commander of all of the troops in Rhode Island. Next slide, please. So as the French were there in Newport, something unusual happened, another sham fight. And this is from the diary of one of those French officers. And he wrote on October 8, 1780, quote, "The soldiers under canvas want to see the enemy, want to hear the cannon. In the absence of the British, Monsieur de Rochambeau created some, and on the 8th he drilled the army on the point where the real enemy might land. We pretended that a fleet entered our harbor and planned a landing. We put some 1,500 men under the command of Viscount de Vonamale and was at Storter's house. It was there that our enemies first began to take possession of a few houses along the shore. Mr. Rochambeau kept the rest of the troops with him for the imminent attack, to which he joined the American Rhode Island Regiment commanded by Colonel Greene. These troops were divided into two columns, and the attack began with several discharges of cannon, well executed to create a complete effect of the fictitious enemy leaving their boats and forming quickly. At the same time, the column of grenadiers advanced to dislodge the enemy from the houses as they began to establish themselves there. During this musket fire, the Baron de Vomenil turned their right under the protection of a hill which concealed his movement. And when he was ready and the attack fully engaged, Mr. Rochambeau had the charge sounded. Everything advanced in good order. The enemy disappeared and reassembled on the seashore. Well, not everything went as planned, even in that sham fight that he writes so wonderfully about. Several people were hurt. One man lost his arm when a cannon went off by accident. Other accidents may have happened. He wrote that many of our Navy officers, wanting to witness the drill, rented horses, but they were really poor horsemen, as 3 or 4 were thrown on the ground with each cannon shot. That must have been a scene. I would have liked to see that. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. Colonel Greene wrote to Washington requesting that if the battalion were not to be called in to join the main army, that they remain in Newport working on fortifications. He wrote to him, quote, "The difficulty of getting supplies of provision has been such that we have been almost entirely without. This has greatly retarded the completion of the very important work at Butts Hill, where the 3 militia from Massachusetts State have been employed." You may not know that while most of the Rhode Islanders were out of the state in the Continental Brigades, many Massachusetts militiamen came into the state at Warwick Neck and also at Barbers Heights to guard the shorelines there as part of the defense of the shorelines. So I am confident they will not be able to put the fort in a defensible state by the time that they leave. Should Your Excellency not call my regiment to join the Army, they will undoubtedly be very usefully employed in making it so. He also requested a reprieve for the recently captured Windsor Fry, writing that the private whom Your Excellency gave a warrant for executing dated on the 1st day of June last was taken up and sent to me almost a fortnight since. It is a doubt with me whether executing him now would have the same effect on the others as if I had it in my power to have put it into immediate execution. Nor do I think an example of the kind so necessary now as then. An unwillingness to take a life when it can possibly be avoided, consistent with the general good, induces me to beg your Excellency to pardon him. I have the honor to be the greatest respect, your Excellency's most obedient servant. So Greene wrote back to Washington, Washington wrote back to Greene, quote, as I never wish to inflict a punishment, especially capital, for the sake of example, and as you think the execution of Windsor Fry not so necessary upon that account now as it was before, you have my consent to pardon him. On October 27, 1780, General George Washington received another letter from Christopher Greene. And he wrote, I wish for instructions on how the Army are to get their pay, as well as for those for the war and the officers. We are exceedingly bare of clothes, both officers and soldiers. My Lieutenant Colonel has written to the Clothier General how our situation in that respect is, and sent him a return of our wants. As the officers have not received pay for a very considerable time, they are not able to purchase clothing. If they could be supplied from the stores on account, it would be very agreeable. By Captain 2 of Colonel Angel's regiment, lately from the Army, I was informed that Congress had in contemplation the reducing of the regiments of the Army to a less number, and that the state of Rhode Island would have but one. If that is or should be done, I suppose there must be some officers out of command. Such of my officers as are likely to be in that situation wish to have early notice of that, if that may be arranged, so they may arrange their affairs. And Greene also made one final plea, one for reassignment. I should be very pleased if Your Excellency could, consistent with the good of the service, order me to the southward with General Greene. That would be General Nathaniel Greene, who was then in the Southern campaign. I have no other motive in asking the favor other than a better opportunity of serving my country than I probably can have here. It is not from any dislike I have to the French troops, but the reverse. I have been treated with the greatest respect and politeness by them, and from the Commander-in-Chief and all under him. Washington was polite but frank in his reply, and he wrote, quote, when the corps from which is to form the new regiment is fixed upon, I shall probably draw the whole to this army. Should it fall to your lot to remain in service, I cannot suppose that you would wish to go southward without your regiment, and I see little chance of it getting to that quarter. I am very pleased to hear of your relations with the French. They have written to me that express their approbation of your conduct on every occasion. So, in November 1780, a detachment of 4 French officers were sent away from Newport to survey the route that was chosen for the Continental Army to pass along its march to the Connecticut River and then to West Point. Next slide, please. So on November 11th, the Marquis de Chastellux recorded in his journal, later published as Travels in North America, quote, I left Newport this day with M. Lynch and M. de Montesquieu, each of which had a servant. I myself had 3, one of whom led an extra horse and another drove a small cart, which I was advised to take to convey my portmanteaus and thus avoid hurting my riding horses. The French Major General would travel with his entourage along the route taken later by Continental officers and troops. As he records, the roads along the route chosen were not always easily navigated. It was also meant to be a kind of reconnaissance mission. The Marquis always seemed to have a keen eye on the landscape as to where encampments and fortifications might be made. Making his way to Scituate, Rhode Island, he stayed with other officers at Angel's Tavern. He moved on to a comfortable night at Governor Jabez Bowen's house in Providence, but will record at the conclusion of the following day's journey. Next slide, please. November 13th. From this place in Voluntown, to Voluntown, the road is very bad. One is continually going uphill and downhill, and always with rough roads. It was at 6 o'clock and night had closed in when I reached Orange's Tavern, which you see here still in existence, which is only 25 miles from Providence. He remained 3 days in Voluntown, albeit in the not unpleasant company of one Miss Pease, while he waited for his cart to appear. But when it did not appear, he would write indignantly that it is proper to observe that my servants, proud of possessing ample means of transporting my effects, had loaded it with many useless articles, that I myself, being appointed that wine was not always to be met with at the inns, had thought proper to furnish myself with canteens which held 12 bottles, lots of wine to bring along, and having taken further precaution to ask for 2 or 3 loaves of white bread from the commissary at Providence, he had packed up to 20, which alone weighed upwards of 80 pounds, so that my poor cart was laden to the point of sinking. So this meant that those servants that he's talking about were members of the Rhode Island Regiment that had been hand-chosen on command to go with him. And so, as he's describing that journey, they would have endured the same exhausting portage. Given the Marquis's assessment of the baggage and supplies packed for the journey, one of these men would be Thomas Nichols, and we'll hear a little bit more about him later. Thomas Nichols would become ill during the wagon drive, revolt with others against the wagon master, return to the encampment in Rhode Island, only to be sent back and fall ill again. And this was the main cause of the delay in the Marquis's wagons and their entourage's wagons. The wagon train's greatest misfortune, as the Marquis would record, quote, arose from striking on the rocks, which had broken one wheel and greatly damaged the other, end quote. After reducing his wagon to a smaller one, the entourage, without Nichols, continued on to Plainfield, Connecticut, and then to Canterbury, a village that pleased the Marquis with its elegant homes. Next slide, please. On November 27, 1780, Washington wrote to Colonel Greene that if ordered by Rochambeau to march, that he only bring those remaining soldiers of the regiment serving for the duration of the war or with 3 years' enlistment to West Point. In Rhode Island, a detachment of troops from the remainder of the regiment was sent to guard stores in Providence in December, while the rest were recalled to their base encampment in East Greenwich. The few weeks given for the preparation of the march passed, and Washington grew impatient for their arrival. He wrote to Rochambeau, and Rochambeau said, they've been gone from Newport a month. I can't imagine what's delaying them. Well, what was delaying them was a last-minute effort to bolster the regiment after the loss of the 6-month Continental Battalion that had been assigned to them, some 600 men altogether. While a return of money dispensed to soldiers to December shows 84 soldiers of the regiment, the receipt for clothing on December 29th, another important thing, you don't want to leave Rhode Island without clothing for the winter. So they waited until December 29th to get that, and by then they had an additional 19 soldiers of the Black Regiment added to the recruits. So on January 5th, 1781, the French Major General Chastelot witnessed the arrival of the detachment from the First Rhode Island Regiment at the ferry crossing for the Connecticut River at Hartford. And he wrote, "This was the same corps we had with us all last summer, but they have since been recruited and clothed. The majority of enlisted men are Negroes or mulattoes, but they are strong, robust men, and those I saw make a very good appearance." Next slide, please. In January 1781, an advertisement in the Providence Gazette announced the recruiting drive for an integrated Rhode Island regiment. Major Ebenezer Flagg led the recruitment in East Greenwich, with Lieutenant Colonel Jeremiah Olney placing an advertisement and recruiting in Providence where, quote, "Negroes will not be received, nor any but able-bodied effective men. Preference should be given as much as possible to those who had served in the Continental Army or in the state battalions." So recruitment would continue in the coming weeks, and despite the proclamation in Olney's advertisement, the Book of Returns shows that a considerable number of men of color did enlist, as well as other soldiers of color who continued to serve in the state and 6-month Continental battalions as they were raised through the remainder of the war. I just take a pause here and say that we talk about the Rhode Island Regiment. That's about 140 men altogether. But what's missing from that equation, and what a lot of people don't realize, are the hundreds of men of color who enlisted for the militia and served 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 months, a year in various places throughout Rhode Island. And so while the Rhode Island Regiment certainly are heroes of the Continental Line, those other men of color are heroes for stepping up and guarding the shorelines during those 8 years of war, all through the war. So on January 18th, 1781, a later date of this day was dictated to a medical assistant from Thomas Nichols, one of the men on command with the Marquis de Chastellux. Change the slide, please. It is addressed to John Nichols, his former master in Warwick, Rhode Island, and it reads, "Honored Master and Mistress, I take this opportunity to inform you of my situation at this time and desire your aid. After I drove 3 wagons as far as Windham, I had wagoneer take away my badge of driving and order me to guard ye wagons, which I refused, and turned back to Colonel Green at Coventry. And ye wagoneer sent back 2 men after me. Ye colonel did not blame me, but told me, ye men and me, to go out again, and that I should take my wagon again. And being over-worried with this tramp, I got but 3 miles further than where I had left ye wagons in South Windham, at ye house of one Dan Murdoch, where I have been confined with my old fits, but have good care taking care of me." But I'll just mention there, he was injured in some way in the Battle of Rhode Island. Thomas Nichols was injured in some way in the Battle of Rhode Island, and that brought on perhaps PTSD or some situation where he'd actually have convulsions when he got overly concerned. And this is what happened to him there, and that's why he was at Dan Murdoch's house. "I have a desire," he writes, "to return to you, not having any money nor clothes fit to wear, and strangers to me makes all things difficult for me, as I have had a doctor and a surgeon mate to me, which advised me to go to the Corps of Invalids at Boston, where I may be under half pay during life remaining in this poor state of body. But I ain't able to go, neither do I incline to, without advice from you. I have a desire that master or mistress will go to Colonel Green and see if you can't get me discharged, both from ye war, as it being very disagreeable to my mind and body, as well as destructive to my health. I suppose I could ride on a horse, or at least in a sleigh, if you could obtain a discharge for me, so that I may return to my master and his family again." Well, Mr. Nichols did not get his wish. He was transferred to the Corps of Invalids, where he remained for another year and a half. And that letter did not get received until January, the middle of January. Next slide, please. In February 1781, the consolidation of the remainder of the First Rhode Island Regiment and the Second Rhode Island Regiment took place during this first week of February. Several veteran officers were chosen for retirement based on seniority. Colonel Christopher Green, Lieutenant Colonel Jeremiah Olney, and Major Ebenezer Flagg were named the commanders and field officers of the Rhode Island Regiment. Detachments of regulars and recruits from Rhode Island arrived at West Point, and they were now well clothed and provided for winter. Their number would reach 436 men by late March. 9 enlisted men of the regiment remained behind in Providence, guarding state and continental stores, as well as patrolling the streets during a period of martial law. Next slide, please. So under martial law, on April 10th, 1781, in the early hours of the morning, the guard at the Providence barracks were awoken by 2 men shouting illiberal language and throwing stones against the barracks walls. The city was under martial law, and the guard there were often challenged by late-night carousers when they patrolled to enforce a midnight curfew. Though this was long after midnight, approaching 1 o'clock in the morning, it was undoubtedly a night of drinking that led 23-year-old Edward Allen, in the company of his friend John Pitcher, to make the fateful decision to go into the barracks and harass the soldiers. The two kicked open the door of the barracks, where a voice in the darkness warned them to get out before they were fired upon. Particulars of the moment are not clear, but as the two men were fleeing the scene, Private Prince Green stepped outside and fired his musket into the darkness. The ball fired struck Edward Allen in the back of the head, mortally wounding him. The incident, as you might imagine, caused an uproar in the city, especially as a soldier of color had fired the shot that killed a white resident. On April 14th, as the state Supreme Court was sitting in Providence at the time, Prince Green was brought swiftly to trial. He was most ably defended by attorney David Howell, an acquaintance of his commander, Colonel Christopher Green. As the city was under martial law, this figured prominently in the defense, as any soldier under guard in such a situation has the right to fire his weapon upon any person deemed a threat to the guard or the populace. Prince Green was found not guilty of willful murder, but found guilty of manslaughter, and as was the punishment of the time, was branded with an M upon his hand. He would be sent back to the regiment for duty in New York. Next slide, please. A month later to the day would come the greatest loss to the regiment, when at dawn in the morning of May 14th, a loyalist force of 160 men of the Westchester County Militia forded the Croton River and raided the Rhode Island encampment, killing and capturing multiple soldiers and cornering as well the commanders Colonel Christopher Green and Major Ebenezer Flagg in the small farmhouse they had commandeered. With only a small guard to protect them, they were overrun quickly. Flagg reportedly fell at the first shots fired through a window. Green was severely outnumbered and confronted his attackers with a sword. He was placed on a horse badly wounded and later dumped beside the road and left to die. The regiment would regroup under command of Lieutenant Colonel Jeremiah Olney and contribute to the building of the breastworks and artillery posts at Yorktown for the successful siege and decisive victory over the British in Virginia. While the Rhode Island Light Infantry under Colonel Stephen Olney, those who had stormed Redoubt Number 10 at Yorktown and won the victory, remained behind on garrison duty, the larger body of the regiment were given orders to move to Gloucester Point. Next slide, please. And that's, next slide. That is Gloucester Point, I'm sorry. That's Gloucester Point, just you see Yorktown and Gloucester Point just above it across the water. So while there, they were taken over under command of Lieutenant Colonel Jeremiah Olney. So while drilling and guarding the prisoners over the next few days at Gloucester Point, the Rhode Island Regiment left quite the impression on at least one of the enemy officers. Captain Johann Ewald of the prestigious Hessian Jaeger Corps would record, quote, "I have seen the Rhode Island Regiment march and perform several mountings of the guard. The men were complete masters of their legs, carried their weapons well, held their heads straight, faced right without moving an eye, and wheeled so excellently without their officers having to shout much that at the regiment it looked like it was dressed in line with a string. I was greatly surprised that the men were not in close formation, arm to arm, but had consistently left a place for a man between every two men, which is a very good thing in penetrating a thick wood or underbrush with entire battalions," end quote. The removal of prisoners was one of concerns of the Army as it secured Yorktown and the harbor after the victory. Knowing that many of the enslaved of the British officers had concealed themselves on boats in the harbor and others offered themselves to American and French officers, Washington issued the order that all officers of the Allied Army and other persons of every denomination concerned are directed not to suffer any such Negroes or mulattoes to be retained in their service, but on the contrary to cause them to be delivered to the guards, which will be established for their reception at one of the redoubts in York and another in Gloucester. In November 1781, the month began with the death of Private Matthew Hart of Captain Stephen Olney's Light Infantry Brigade. It was a harbinger of the grim months ahead. As historian Daniel Popick would write, November 1781 began the greatest of two significant dying events that the Rhode Island Continental Line suffered through the long war. The Valley Forge death event 2 years before had been brought about by malnutrition and severe field conditions, but the post-Yorktown episode was caused primarily by infectious disease. Next slide, please. So the Rhode Island Regiment at Gloucester Point received orders to embark on vessels at the head of Elk, Maryland, from where soldiers would march overland and garrison the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Here is a wonderful picture by Don Troiani, the historical artist, of them entering the city of Philadelphia with that great uniform that Jason is wearing so well there. When they did get to Philadelphia, however, General Ezekiel Cornell and William Ellery, the two Rhode Island delegates of the Continental Congress, wrote to Governor William Greene of the state of the regiment. They wrote on December 6, 1781, "We apprehend you will be a little surprised at the deficiency that will appear in your regiment when Colonel Olney's returns come to hand. The colonel arrived at the head of Elk with his regiment after having experienced almost every kind of distress in a long passage by water from Yorktown. The regiment is very sickly. The smallpox has got among the last recruits. In this case, they are not alone, many from other regiments being down with it as well." Death continued to plague the regiment through the month of December 1781, as they lost another 43 soldiers to illness. On arrival, the regiment took barracks in a large facility called the Philadelphia Barracks. The barracks had been constructed during the French and Indian War and took up an entire city block, and you see them there on the right of that picture. It was 2 stories high with a gallery the whole length and ample parade ground in front, capable of sheltering 2,000 or 3,000 men. Next slide, please. The barracks were shared with other military units, and passing soldiers would often stay overnight en route to their destination. Now, back in the head of Elk, another incident took place on December 22nd, 1781, where Private Fortune Stoddard, a black veteran of the 8th Company of the Rhode Island Regiment, was confined to jail in Mercer County, Virginia, charged with murder after an unfortunate series of events that had begun the previous evening. Stoddard and other soldiers, most of whom were likely ill since they remained at Head of Elk, were housed on the first floor of the Jane Clark House. On the evening of the 21st, a party of sailors from a local sailing vessel under Captain James Cunningham began celebrating on the second floor of the house. None of the regiment attempted to go upstairs and quiet the gathering, but at some point, Captain Cunningham came downstairs and began insulting the soldiers of the First Rhode Island Regiment. A quarrel ensued, and Cunningham began to assault Private Stoddard with his fists and then with a chair. Stoddard informed the captain that if he could not be civil, that he would complain to his commanding officer. The drunken captain returned upstairs to continue his revelry. Shortly after 9 p.m., Lieutenant Ebenezer Wales of the 1st Connecticut Continental Regiment entered the house to investigate the incident. He observed the party and confronted Cunningham, and the captain once again began violent and challenged the lieutenant to a fight with fists, swords, or pistols, whatever be your choice. Lieutenant Wales ordered the able-bodied soldiers quartered downstairs to arm themselves against the sailors and turn them outdoors. On seeing the soldiers with their muskets and fixed bayonets, the sailors left the house without incident. They returned the next morning, however, hurling insults from the streets and breaking into the house to demand liquor from the landlady. When it was refused, the captain went on the rampage, breaking a chair and floorboards before being confronted by 2 of the soldiers quartered downstairs who had come up unarmed, hearing the commotion. One of the soldiers was almost immediately struck with a board, knocking him to the floor. The other, a Private Benjamin Blanchard of the Light Infantry Company, retreated back downstairs where the other armed soldiers were waiting. Private Robert Piper of the 3rd Company stepped forward as Cunningham and others came down the stairs. He presented his musket to the breast of the captain, only to have the weapon grabbed from him by Cunningham and another sailor. The captain then swung the butt of the musket against the head of Private Piper, and it was then that Private Stoddard fired his musket at the captain, striking him in the groin. He reloaded his musket, and the sailors dragged their wounded captain to another room, where he died within 2 hours of the incident. Private Stoddard was taken into custody and confined to await trial. That same day, the Rhode Island Regiment was ordered to assume the guard duties in Philadelphia, which had previously been kept by local militia. Next slide. I'm sorry, go back to that slide one more time. My apologies. So on December 23rd, 1781, assuming the guard, the Rhode Island Regiment posted details at the barracks, the city powder magazine, and the large stone jail at the intersection of Walnut and 6th Street, located just south of the famous Pennsylvania State House. Since the British evacuation of Philadelphia in June 1778, the prison had been used to house British and German prisoners of war, as well as convicted Tories. The command of the regiment was turned over to Colonel Coggeshall Olney as Lieutenant Jeremiah Olney returned to Rhode Island to prepare to recruit more soldiers. Death continued to take its toll on the regiment, even while he went to recruit more. Another 39 soldiers died in December, some housed in the hospital at Wilmington, Delaware, the others in the Philadelphia hospital. A small ceremony was held to bury the Rhode Islanders who had died in the city. Their bodies were placed in plain wooden coffins constructed by members of their regiment and carried to an open trench to be interred, as were over 2,000 soldiers of the Revolution before them in Potter's Field, close to what is now in Washington Square in Philadelphia. On January 19, 1782, a detachment of Rhode Islanders that had remained at West Point arrived in Philadelphia. Among them was Lieutenant Jeremiah Greenman, who would record the following day that he found the regiment very sickly and much reduced with deaths. Major Coggeshall Olney would write to Colonel Jeremiah Olney of the continued loss of the regiment and to inform him that the Minister of Finance, Robert Morris, had supplied the regiment with yet more wooden boards for coffins, bunks, and other needed items. On February 3rd, 1782, Lieutenant Oliver Jenks became the latest casualty of the epidemic sweeping the hospital. Just a month before, he had undergone an arduous journey to Kings Ferry to meet a baggage train that carried clothing and supplies for the troops at Philadelphia. On his return with the baggage, he fell ill almost immediately and died within a few days. On March 22nd, with the arrival of General Baron von Steuben in Philadelphia, the able-bodied men of the Rhode Island Regiment, dressed in newly arrived clothing and equipped with new muskets, bayonets, and musical instruments, practiced drills and maneuvers in the morning and again in the afternoon. The following day, the Rhode Island Regiment was paraded and drilled once again on the Philadelphia Commons before an assembled gathering that included the current President of the Continental Congress, John Hanson of Maryland. Next slide, please. On March 29, 1782, the Rhode Island Regiment was presented with a new standard, believed to be made by seamstress Rebecca Young. The standard is believed to be the RIR banner long held in the Rhode Island State House. The staff and restoration team of the James Mitchell Varnum Museum in East Greenwich have raised an effort recently to restore the flag and retrieve it from storage in a conservation facility. By April 7th, the Rhode Island Regiment assumed guard detail of the flag of truce site at Philadelphia Harbor. On this first night of guard detail, under command of Lieutenant John Hubbard of the 3rd Company, a brig that had been anchored under a flag of truce was noticed with some activity, and a boat was seen leaving the vessel. As the guard were on their passage to the brig and noticed a small boat coming from the vessel, Lieutenant Hubbard ordered the craft to halt. But his command was ignored, and he ordered the guard to fire upon the boat. Well, the result of that was that 2 inhabitants of the city were wounded in the craft, though they managed to reach shore. Lieutenant Hubbard was later confined to his room at the barracks and replaced in the guard by Lieutenant Jeremiah Greenman Whoops, okay. On April 18th, 1782, after a lengthy and difficult march, some 70 now seasoned recruits under Adjutant John Rogers arrived from Providence to be added to the rolls of the Rhode Island Regiment for 90 days' service. This was the result of Jeremiah Olney's recruiting in Rhode Island the previous month. 8 days later, another 56 recruits under Lieutenant Benjamin L. Peckham marched into Philadelphia. But by May 6, 1782, after a winter that was long in disciplinary hearings and court-martials of numerous soldiers during their stay in Philadelphia, the officers of the Rhode Island Regiment appealed to Major General Benjamin Lincoln for his assistance in deploying the regiment to the encampment of the Great Northern Army. From a letter from Major Benjamin Lincoln to General George Washington, quote, "I beg leave to suggest to your Excellency the expediency of removing the Rhode Island Regiment from the vices and follies of the city by calling them to camp. The commanding officer informs me that a great portion of them must be committed to the surgeon's care before they will be able to and fit to take the field, and that some of them, unless they are soon amended to, will be lost to the service for the campaign. The recruits, who appear to be a good set of lads, will too soon, from the example of the others, be led astray. I think we had better submit to the necessity of calling a few militia to do duty in this city than ruin one of the best regiments in service. I have the honor to be, with the most perfect esteem and respect, your most obedient servant, B. Lincoln." On May 13th, the Continental Congress, having put aside the day of May 13th as a day of celebration of the recent birth of the Dauphin of France, invited the Honorable Chevalier de la Luzerne, Minister Plenipotentiary of France, to join the celebration. As the Rhode Island Regiment was the largest Continental battalion in the city at this time, they were paraded with great ceremony before the visiting dignitaries in his suite. After an exchange of speeches at the State House, the minister was brought back out to the steps and conducted to the stairs where, quote, "a continental salute was then fired by the artillery. By the vessels in the harbor gave a general salute, and the troop fired a feu de joie of artillery and musketry." Just a few days later, Colonel Cargill Olney of the Rhode Island Regiment received an order from George Washington. "Immediately upon the receipt of this order, you will put the Rhode Island Regiment in motion and conduct it by easy marches and the most convenient route to join the army on the North River. You must take care to bring on with you every man who is able to march, except such a detachment as the Secretary of War may think proper to order as an escort for the British office." So from the diary of Lieutenant Greenman on May 29th, "This morning we left Philadelphia at 10 o'clock, came as far as Frankfort, 5 miles from the city, where we made a halt an hour, and then parted with some of our friends who had come with us from the city. Here we proceeded to Bensalem, where we encamped." In June 1782, Private Fortune Stoddard, who had been jailed for murder, as you might recall, was tried by a civilian court for murder, and while acquitted of that crime, was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to be burnt on the brawn of the left thumb with a hot iron. Stoddard was also ordered to pay all court costs, but as he could not raise the full amount owed the court, the county sought to sell him into slavery in order to cover the costs owed. After an exchange between Maryland authorities and Colonel Jeremiah Olney, the colonel appeared to Washington to help remedy the court's decision. The costs for Stoddard's trial and confinement were eventually paid by the Continental Congress, and he returned to Rhode Island. The final year of the war would see the Rhode Island Regiment assigned to forage and marine patrols at Dobbs Ferry and Verplank's Point. By the beginning of winter 1782, they were ordered into winter quarters in Saratoga, New York. Their last winter as soldiers of the Continental Line would truly be one of discontent and discomfort. In December, a detachment of the regiment was sent out to assist with the capture of a pair of loyalist activists and numerous deserters in the Green Hills of Vermont. The pair of loyalists had fled by the time of their arrival, but the regiment did return with about a dozen deserters. Next slide, please. The following February, an ill-guided expedition for a surprise attack on Fort Oswego on the Canadian border went disastrously and caused a good number of the regiment to suffer frostbite and other injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. News of the cessation of hostilities announced by Washington in June was celebrated throughout the colonies, but those troops assigned as the Rhode Island Regiment were to areas considered vulnerable to British incursions and were kept on patrol. In June, Adjutant Jeremiah Greenwich issued his last orders for the regiment at Saratoga and signed the discharge certificates for their release. Per orders of Lieutenant Colonel Olney, the regiment removed from Saratoga in stages, beginning on the 13th of June, with the company departing under Captain Hughes, and on successive days, Captain Holden and Humphreys also began the return march to Rhode Island. These soldiers arrived in Rhode Island by late June, but as historian Pojack would note, there were no parades or celebrations for these experienced troops. There was no notice of their arrival in the local newspapers. So too were the remaining men of the Rhode Island Regiment neglected. The General Assembly did not act to send any further clothing or provisions. The first fall of snow occurred in October, and within weeks, the men who remained in Saratoga were in a desperate situation. As December came, Adjutant Jeremiah Greenwood would write of the men there were continuing in garrison, waiting anxiously for the order to leave this post. Our men are in a most miserable condition, some of them not a shoe or stocking to their feet, and the climate at this place much severer than in the eastern states. So the crux of it was that they were waiting to get clothing. They were waiting to get enough shoes and stockings and clothing to return, to leave Saratoga and return to Rhode Island. So on December 5th, 1783, the regiment received their orders to leave. The next 2 weeks were spent in preparing to leave the garrison, including the procurement of shoes for the men. Next slide. On December 25th, Christmas Day, 1783, the remaining men and officers of the Rhode Island Regiment marched from Saratoga. The return to Rhode Island was a severe march through difficult weather. The men first arrived near Providence after a march from Worcester, Massachusetts on January 3rd, but had to turn back because of high snow drifts on the Providence Road. It rained the next few days and the troops slogged on. Greenman recording that this morning it rained and the roads were excessively bad. In many places, the water over the tops of my boots. Came into Attleboro where breakfasted. From thence came 18 miles to Providence. Again, the Rhode Island Regiment returned without fanfare and little recognition. It would take years for many of those not severely wounded to receive pay and pensions. Despite these hardships, each and every one of these men who applied for pensions reflect the pride taken in their service and the recognition by the public in later parades and ceremonies for these soldiers of the Revolution. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions.
How do they travel from Rhode Island to Philadelphia?
How did they travel? On foot. On foot and by water. Obviously, from Yorktown, they went to Yorktown first, and they took part in the Battle of Yorktown. The Rhode Island Regiment were largely given the task of digging the trenches for the French cannons that would be brought in to fire against the British redoubts. They later took command of those trenches and were actually in the trenches while Lieutenant Olney and the brigade were charging Redoubt Number 10, which was the final battle there. But from there, they took boats to Philadelphia, and from Philadelphia marched to Saratoga, from Saratoga marched. It was all about marching. Why shoes, stockings, and comfortable clothing were of all importance. And unfortunately, usually pretty depleted.
Do you know how many men started and ended soldiers?
Oh, so I know that roughly 140 men enlisted who were former slaves. That eventually, the regiment did not have enough then. 140 is not enough for an entire battalion. So they added free men of color, free indigenous people as well as indigenous, a handful of indigenous slaves, as well as indentured servants of European descent. And the regiment fluctuated pretty wildly throughout the war. Those indentured servants of European descent quickly found out war was not for them, and a lot of them deserted. Some of the Rhode Island Regiment, some of the blacks deserted as well, being scared of the war, and obviously not a great situation. And many whites deserted as well. Desertion was a key problem throughout the war for the Army. And they fought repeatedly, made different attempts, bonuses, all kinds of things to try and prevent that from happening, but it happened mostly throughout the war. Yes, sir.
Would you comment a system that was used to organize the so-called Black Regiment? There were not interspersed companies, but rather there were distinct black companies and white companies. There doesn't seem to be any other report that I can find of any other unit that was composed this way. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, there were several black companies, and after Varnum made the proposal to Washington to have this company, and it was approved by Washington, this company made up of what they hoped to be all people of color, there was actually an attempt by a captain in a Boston regiment who wanted to, again, form a black regiment for Boston Harbor. They would be out there in Boston Harbor protecting the harbor. And he believed that putting a black regiment together would make the blacks in that regiment want to outdo the whites in every way. And he thought that this was something that would prove promising for the Army. And throughout the course of the war, there were David Humphreys put together a black regiment in Massachusetts. So there were the Massachusetts Bucks as well towards the end of the war, which was an all-black regiment. But largely, after 1780, 1781, when the Rhode Island regiments were co-aligned, Washington really believed that integrating the Army was preferable to having segregated units. He thought that the experienced white soldiers would be a benefit to the blacks, and the blacks would perform better in that situation. And that was largely the case throughout the Continental Army, regiments throughout different states that had integrated regiments as well. Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Well, Bob, I want to thank you very much for all your work.
Well, thank you.
And you get our new
Wow, look at that.
Battle Rhode Island hat.
That's beautiful.
And all of our commemorative coins,
Wow.
including the one we just issued today for the Black Regiment.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You have one more